Okay, thank you very much for getting the opportunity to give a very short overview of the gut microbiome and how it develops. And particularly in this igloo, it's so hot outside, and then to be in an igloo here, it's a bit strange. But anyway, these are my conflicts of interest. And the human gut microbiome, many of you have heard about the gut microbiome, and it really, in the last few years, has been a very topical area, because we've realized actually that half the cells in the body are not human at all. They're bacteria. They live in the gut. There's a huge variability in the types of species that one of us can have. There's an enormous number of genes, so less than 1% of the genes in the human body are human. When you think of all these numbers, just to put in perspective, this is really a very important organ. And I think what really we're realizing is that these microbes secrete a lot of primary and secondary metabolites that can be absorbed, that can have effects in distant body sites. And more than 1/3 of the metabolites that you measure in urine are not human at all. They're bacterial derived. So again, just to give an overview for how significant these bacteria are. And then you come to fungi, viruses, bacteriophages. We know very, very little about these, but probably they're just as important, and that's something for the future that we have to look at. So why do we have a microbiome? So the microbes will compete for space, for nutrients, so the non-pathogenic bacteria can help keep out the pathogens. Of course, it's very important for the immune system to see a diverse and range of different molecules, and it seems that many bacteria actually provide immune system stimulation and drive immune tolerance. From a nutrition and metabolism point of view, bacteria are extremely important. They will metabolize certain foods that we cannot digest. They will provide certain nutrients that we couldn't get from food. And they have a very significant effect in controlling our metabolism. And I think one of the areas that is really a hot topic for the last few years is the influence of gut bacteria on behavior and mood development, and particularly from an anxiety point of view. And in red here, I've put in what changes in some of these bacteria have been associated with, from changes with gut diseases to metabolic dysfunction, to, of course, allergies and asthma, and also some CNS effects, particularly anxiety. There's a lot of work coming out about this. And, of course, all of these are interactive. And so at the previous session, we were talking about the overlap between obesity and asthma, with the microbiome as one of the central axes for how that is mediated, and I think that's very true. So we need our microbes. We're not born with microbes. It takes a period of time to develop the gut microbial community. There's many studies have shown this now. I've picked this one because what I like about this one is this is data from one single infant, but sampled many, many times. So if you look at the x-axis, this is the time in days, up to 900 days, and each dot is a sample from that same infant. And you can see that over those days, you increase in the diversity of the bacterial community. You can also see there's some time points that go up or dip down. So from here, does this work? Yeah. So these time points are associated with, for example, post-antibiotic use. So you can see there's an effect, but the microbiome catches back up again. So this is showing diversity. On the right-hand side is showing the same data, but in a different way. It's looking at the actual bacteria that are there. So what you see is this succession of different bacteria coming in at different times over the first couple of years of life. So it's not just that you increase diversity, actually the types of bacteria also change over this time period. And this, to my mind, is primarily driven by diet. Many people ask me how important is genetics in shaping the gut microbiota. I don't think it's very important, and this is a study that supports also what I think. And basically what these people have shown is that the explanation of the variability in the microbiome composition is explained only less than 2% by genetics. So genetics have a very, very minor role in determining what type of microbiome you have. Whereas if you look at the bottom, and in the same paper they looked at a whole load of exposures and environmental exposures, and this explains 20% of microbiome composition. So it's much more important what you're exposed to and what you do, not what your genetics are from a microbiome composition point of view. And actually, very nicely, they showed that the microbiome could explain the variability of certain host phenotypes. Admittedly, these are all metabolic phenotypes. So the microbiome composition explains 35% of the differences in HDL levels in this group, which is more than the genetics. So genetics will also give a contribution to this. But what was really nice was they found both were additive. So if genetics explain 20% of a disease and microbiome explains 20% of the disease, if you put the two together, you can explain 40%. So they're separate and additive. Now, most of the exposures that were important for development of the microbiome were actually diet related, which is perhaps not a surprise. So the microbes in the gut will also ferment and use the food that you eat. And one of the foods that we are particularly interested in from a microbiome point of view are fibers. So these are non-digestible fibers. When you eat them, you cannot digest them, but your bacteria in the gut can. They're fermented, and they lead to the generation of short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, acetate, and propionate. And with Caroline and Remo, we have recently published our results on 1-year-old children looking at short-chain fatty acids early in life and the risk of allergy and asthma later in life. And I'm not going to go through all the data this morning. I'm just going to show the graphical abstract from the paper. But basically what we showed was that consumption of fruits and veg, so fibers, early in life are associated with a higher level of butyrate in 1-year-old children. And those children with the highest levels of butyrate had a significantly reduced rate of sensitization, atopic dermatitis, food allergy, allergic rhinitis, and asthma by school age, by 6 years of age. So having a high level of short-chain fatty acids early in life was really protective. And we feel, at least from mouse models that we ran, part of that is due to the short-chain fatty acids driving the development of T regulatory cells, which you can find in the lungs of these animals that are protected. So what influences the microbiome development in a child? So I said diet is one important part. This is a review that we wrote a couple of months ago. And one of the things that I often get asked as well, and I would like to address this today, is the hygiene hypothesis, while it is true that birth order is important for your risk of allergy, it doesn't explain why all of these other exposures actually protect or have an influence on allergy risk, and also have an effect on the types of microbiomes that are built up in the first couple of years of life. So we've looked at this a slightly different way, looking at island ecology theory. So this has been theory that's been around for a very long time. It's looking at how new species develop on an isolated island anywhere in the world. And this is determined by a number of things. So something has to get there. So it's called dispersal. You have to get new species coming from somewhere else. That's dependent on how many islands are close by, the sizes of those islands, the prevailing conditions. And then once something gets to the island, it has to survive. So it has to have the right food, for instance, or there can be extinction events. So you can have a catastrophe that everything gets killed of a certain species. So all this theories, what if we put the baby in there? Is the baby the island now? And we start to apply all of those theories. And actually, when we did this, and we've just published this in Allergy, it actually fits very, very well. So the transmission or dispersal of microbes to the baby comes from the mother, comes from other kids, comes from other individuals. The survival factors are things like diet. So you need the right diet to keep the right bugs going. So, for example, the human milk oligosaccharides are very important for survival of the BIFs. Antibiotics is an extinction event. And actually, when we start to map all of these things out, and again, I won't go through it everything today because of time reasons, everything that we know influences the microbiome, and that also has an influence on allergy risk, can be mapped to these three different things. So immigration, dispersal, extinction, and survival. And so this is what we've called the paper, actually, is the importance of social networks. But the social networks are us. So we think that the bacteria you get from other people is more important than the bacteria you get from a general environment. It's not saying that biodiversity isn't important, it is. But we feel that the evolution of specific species to coexist with the host has happened over millions of years. And you have bacteria that are human adapted. And these are probably the ones which will have the most beneficial effects on humans. And to get these, the best place to get them is from other humans. So that's what we've concluded in the paper, that it maybe bacteria from other humans might be the most important. And actually, this paper appeared just a few weeks ago, which is really nice. They looked at numbers of bacteria that were shared between people living in the same household, in the same environment. And basically what they could show was they could identify who was living in the same house. They could identify who was married to who, for some people, but not for everybody. There was obviously a mother-child connection. People within the same village. You could predict who was living in the same village from their gut microbiome composition. So we really do share our microbes. And I think this is an important thing I want you to go away from today, that social networks are important. And yeah, I can finish there. Thank you.